On this week's episode of Cody Builds, Elsworth finally gets a power plant. I get the TKX 5-speed transmission bolted up to the back of our freshly rebuilt Ford 390, and we drop the drivetrain down into the chassis. Now, first things first, I had to get the pilot bushing into the back of the crank. And thankfully, there was not already a pilot bushing stuck in the back of the crank, so I did not have to deploy the bread technique to get that old pilot bushing out. And yes, the bread technique, that's a real thing. You should look it up. The next step was to get the flywheel lined up and bolted in place. This does require a little bit of patience on the Ford FE block because these 6 bolts are not evenly spaced. So you do have to find the proper orientation of the flywheel on the crankshaft in order to get all 6 bolts lined up. The directions called for blue Loctite on the flywheel bolts, so I put a little Loctite on all the threads of each of these bolts, and then I use this ARP assembly lubricant underneath the head of the flywheel bolts. This allows the head of the flywheel bolt to slide on the flywheel and reduces friction so that as we're torquing these down to specification, we're getting a good torque measurement. Next up was installing the bell housing, and I did go ahead and fasten this down to the back of the block, and I did torque it to specification in preparation for measuring the bell housing runout. All right, guys, so in order to do this TKX install, there's 2 measurements that we're gonna have to make in order to ensure that this installation goes smoothly. The first is bell housing runout. What is the bell housing runout alignment? Let's call this the interior hole of our bell housing and that our crankshaft. What we're trying to do is make sure that this crankshaft is centered within the opening of this bell housing. If it's not, let's exaggerate this a little bit and say that bell housing, that the crankshaft is offset in the bell housing. What's going to happen is the input shaft of the transmission rides in the pilot bushing of the crankshaft here, and if this is offset, you have mounting holes for your case. Now you're going to have a lot of tension on that input shaft. That's going to cause unnecessary wear and probably premature failure within your transmission. So what we're trying to do is take a measurement and ensure that our crankshaft is centered in the bell housing. If it's not, what we're going to have to do is install offset dowel pins that are going to shift the bell housing in one direction. So how do we do this? This is the inside of our bell housing once again. We are going to install a dial indicator on a magnetic base. That magnetic base is going to be stuck to the crankshaft, or the flywheel in this case. On the dial indicator, the first spot we measure, we're just going to zero that out and call that 0. We're going to rotate this dial indicator around by turning the crankshaft. As this rotates around, what we're going to be watching for is the largest runout at any point around this rotation. So as we travel from 0, you might see it go negative and then go positive. Wherever you get the largest positive measurement, we're going to call that location our new 0. So just for the sake of argument, let's say that point is here and the measurement is 0.015 inches, okay? The next thing you're going to do now is you are going to reset this as your 0 point, and this will now be your 180 point down here. And you are going to again align your dial indicator here. And once your dial indicator is set up and you've got this zeroed and you've got your indicator zeroed, we're going to rotate this around to the 180 degree mark and we're going to take a measurement. Now, let's say that when we take this measurement, what we're seeing down here is 0.016 inches, okay? That's what we measure. We're going to take that number and we're going to divide that by 2, okay? And that number now equals 0.0080 inches. This is the total runout of our crankshaft to our bell housing. Now the tolerance on runout is 0.0050 inches. So you can see that right now our runout is greater than our spec is. That means we are going to have to install offset dowel pins, and when we do that, the dowel pins are down here in our bell housing on our Ford. We need to install dowel pins that are going to shift the direction of the bell housing back towards the 0 point. So we need to install those parallel, and what we'd be looking for is something like a 7/1000 offset that's going to shift these back in this direction 7/1000 of an inch, which should reduce our run out to about 1/1000, which would be less than our 5/1000 of an inch. I'm going to take you through exactly how to do this on the bell housing and the crankshaft so you can see this firsthand and understand exactly how to do this measurement. It's very critical that you do this. If you don't get your run out within spec, it's likely that your transmission would not be honored under a warranty situation. So very critical measurement. You must do this measurement when you're installing an aftermarket bell housing. So the second measurement we're going to need to take is the hydraulic release bearing clearance. Now this is critical to ensure that we're getting good engagement of our clutch disc on the flywheel, and that when the clutch pedal is released, that it's fully disengaging from the pressure plate, making sure that our clutch disc is in fact fully engaged with the flywheel. So I'm going to draw a quick drawing here of the actual system, and this is our flywheel. So this is, let's call this like a side-on view, okay? That's our flywheel. This is our clutch disc here, okay? This we're gonna call our pressure plate. And the pressure plate has springs that come down inside of it, okay? So we're gonna leave that open in the center. This is our hydraulic release bearing, or our throwout bearing, okay? That sits on the input shaft of the transmission, and then we've got our transmission back here. What happens here, this is a hydraulic system, so there's going to be two lines coming off of it. One's going to be a bleeder, one's going to be a pressurized line, right? When you press down on the clutch pedal, this is going to send hydraulic pressure up the line. And when the pressure comes up the line, what it's going to do is expand this bearing. And that might seem counterintuitive, but the pressure plate in its static state with no forces on it is putting pressure, downward pressure, on the clutch disc into the flywheel, okay? So you constantly have pressure holding the clutch disc to the flywheel. When this expands, consider these like cantilevered springs in here. So as you put pressure down on these springs, what it actually does is it lifts pressure off of the clutch disc, okay? Disengaging the clutch disc from the flywheel. Okay, so that's what happens when you press the clutch pedal. Pressure goes into the bearing expands, it puts pressure on your pressure plate, releasing the pressure from the pressure plate on the clutch disc, disengaging the flywheel from the transmission, okay? That's how this hydraulic bearing, throwout bearing works. Now, what can happen if you don't have proper adjustment here? This gap right in here, so the gap between your pressure plate and your hydraulic throwout bearing is critical. And this area here is what we mean by hydraulic release bearing clearance, okay? What we need to ensure is that when we release the clutch pedal and this bearing retracts into itself, okay, so now it's coming back in, now the pressure plate is releasing pressure, the bearing is releasing pressure off the pressure plate, and force is being applied back to our clutch disc, back onto our flywheel, and we're engaged with the transmission again. We need to ensure that there is some amount of clearance here so that the pressure plate can fully engage the clutch disc onto the flywheel. If there is no gap or not enough gap here, what happens is we don't get the full downforce of this, we only get partial, okay? The pressure plate's not fully pressing the clutch disc into the flywheel. This can cause slippage or flat out just not engage the clutch onto the flywheel, and you're not gonna go anywhere. The other thing that we need to be wary of is these clutch discs are going to wear over time. And you would think that as it wears, you'd get more clearance here, but what happens is you actually get less clearance here. As these springs wear, the tip of these springs is going to want to move in this direction towards the hydraulic bearing, okay? So we need to set a reasonable gap here that it's going to account for clutch wear and ensure that our hydraulic release bearing fully disengages every single time. If we set this too small down the line as this clutch wears out, we might run into clearance issues here where your transmission starts slipping in gear because you're not getting full engagement of the pressure plate onto the clutch disc onto the flywheel. So that's what we're measuring. Now, how do we measure that? Essentially, what we're going to do, we are going to install the bell housing, okay? So I'm just gonna roughly draw the bell housing here. Inside the bell housing, we've got our flywheel, right? It's our flywheel again. We've got our clutch disc. We've got our pressure plate. We are gonna put a straight edge across the back of the bell housing here. Okay, we're gonna take a dial caliper gauge. We're gonna put that dial caliper down on the tip of the spring where the bearing is going to engage. And we're gonna measure up to our straight edge here. Okay, we're gonna take a measurement, and this is not gonna be anywhere near what the measurement is. I'm just gonna throw it out there. Let's say that's 3.512 inches, okay? From here to our straight edge. And then let's say, because we're measuring across a straight edge, let's say that straight edge is an inch thick, we need to subtract an inch, so this measurement would be 2.512 inches. We need to take a corresponding measurement on the transmission side. Okay, so now not drawn to scale because I'm running out of room here, but we've got our transmission, tail housing here, input shaft. We need to put our bearing. We need to put our bearing on the shaft here, okay, and slide that all the way down into position, okay? And we need to take a measurement from the bell housing face we'll put a flat edge across that bearing. We need to measure from the bell housing, where the transmission mounts to the bell housing, out to this straight edge, okay? And let's just say that that number is 3.612, just to keep it simple. We subtract our 1 inch for the straight edge again, and we're at 2.612. And what we're gonna do is subtract these two numbers, okay? So 2.612 minus 2.512 is 0.100. The spec for this gap is 0.125 inches, okay? So we do not have enough gap here. We actually need to move or space our hydraulic clutch bearing back towards the transmission. Now, how is that done? On this particular model, the Tilton 6100, it's got this adjustable sleeve in the bearing here. So let's just say we just taken that measurement and we're 0.025 inches too close in gap. You could actually screw this in to get your 0.025 inches, make another measurement until we hit that number, and then that's where we would install that bearing. So some other instances, you may have a spacer or bushings that you need to add or subtract to this bearing in order to get the proper spacing. So those are the two critical measurements we need to take. I'm going to show you how to do both of those measurements on the transmission in this video. In order to measure the bell housing runout, I had to set up the dial indicator on the inside face of the bell housing. Now, this proved to be a little more challenging than I anticipated. It's a tight space to work in, and the magnetic base of the stand did not really want to stick to the flywheel because it was sitting on top of the flywheel bolts. So I was struggling with that. I was struggling to get the dial indicator lined up, but eventually I did manage to get myself off the struggle bus and get the dial indicator set up in an appropriate position. All right, so you guys can see we got our starting point here. We just marked this as 0. We marked our gauge as 0. What I'm going to do is I'm going to rotate the crank around, and I want you all to keep an eye on this gauge, and you're going to tell me at the point at which we have the highest reading off of this gauge. That is going to become our new 0 point. So I need you to keep an eye on this and let me know at what point in my rotation around the crank we have the highest reading on this gauge. All right, now if you guys were watching and you telling me right, it looked like our highest reading is somewhere around here. It reads about 4,000 somewhere down in here, and it stays at 4,000s, and it doesn't start to drop until somewhere over here. So I'm going to start to rotate this over again, and when I get into this area and get to the high spot, you guys yell again, I'm going to stop there, and that's going to become our new 0 point. We now got this pointer just after the point where it started to drop on the gauge here. So I'm going to go ahead and take my paint pen, and we're going to mark just before that needle as our new 0 point, and we're going to come out 180 degrees. So I'm going to mark 180 about right there, and this is going to be our new 0 point here. And to eliminate any confusion, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to wipe this off the bell housing. All right, now with this set to our proper location here, I'm going to now turn my gauge back to 0. We're going to readjust this to 0. And I need y'all to yell at me again when we get to 180 degrees out. We're going to take a measurement there, and that's going to determine if we need offset dowel pins or if we have proper alignment with our bell housing. All right, guys, so thank you for stopping me. Look how good we stopped that right on the 180 mark there. So reading our gauge here now, we are looking at about 0.0045, okay? So I'm just gonna write 0.0045 right there. So it's written down, we know what it is. So that means the difference in measurement between our 0 point and right here is 0.0045, but that is not what our total misalignment is. Now this is where it can get confusing for some folks. What this basically means is the bell housing is shifted in this direction towards our 0.0045. It's shifted 0.0045 out of alignment this direction. So some people would think, okay, well you get a, first of all, that's in spec. So we're not gonna have to use offset dowel pins here. But what this means is not that there's a total misalignment of 0.0045, it's actually half of that. And the reason is, if you were to move this whole bell housing back in this direction, shift it directly this direction towards the 0.0045 inches, what you would have is you'd have 0.005 plus 0.0045 inches here and 0 here. So you'd still be, you're just shifting your complete misalignment in one direction. So you actually need to split this in half. So 0.0045 divided by 2 is 0.00225, okay? So we're looking at 22 10,000ths, or just over 2 thousandths of an inch. The spec for this is 5 thousandths of an inch. So we are in great alignment here right out of the box. So we do not have to do anything further with this bell housing, and we can move forward with installing the clutch, the pressure plate, and the throwout bearing. So that's really great news, guys. That was my one fear here this week, was that we were gonna end up having to order a set of offset dowel pins and install and wait for them to arrive before we could install the rest of the clutch. But that is not the case. We're actually really lined up really well, so I'm super happy with that. Now it's time to install the clutch and the pressure plate. So I pulled the bell housing off and I'm cleaning the flywheel here with some solvent. I'm just using brake cleaner here. You want to avoid using any solvent that has a lubricant or oil in it, and the reason for that is that oil or lubricant will then embed itself into your clutch material and it will ruin your clutch. So here I'm installing the clutch into the flywheel using the clutch alignment tool, and this disc specifically calls out which side is the flywheel side. Next up, we're installing the pressure plate, and note that the alignment tool stays inside while we are tightening up these bolts, And every so often, I'm going to check that alignment tool and make sure that it can slide easily in and out, meaning the clutch is in line with the crankshaft. Now I'm installing all of the bolts onto the pressure plate, and I'm doing those incrementally. I'm trying not to tighten down one side faster than the other, so I'm putting about a turn into each bolt in a star pattern until we reach the final torque spec for those bolts. And then at the very end again, I'm going to pull out my alignment tool and make sure it slides in and out easily. If it has any resistance on it or does not slide in and out easily, you'll have to loosen up the pressure plate, realign the clutch disc, and then tighten things back down again. All right, so we got our pressure plate torqued down now, and if you didn't catch it, I forgot to put the washers on these bolts, so I did end up pulling them off one by one, cleaning up the Loctite, and then retightening them down. So just make sure you've got all the hardware in the right places when you bolt this down. Now, all along the way here, I was checking on our installation alignment tool here, our clutch disc alignment tool, and making sure that we weren't putting too much tension on this thing. And it slides out on its own pretty easily here. That's important for alignment of the transmission. So when we go to stab the transmission in here, we should now be able to align that clutch up with the pilot bushing and get that pushed all the way in fairly easy. Shouldn't be too bad. So we can now pull this alignment tool out because we've got the clutch disc pinched in there between the pressure plate and the flywheel. It shouldn't go anywhere. The one note of caution is when you do install the transmission onto the bell housing, you don't want to let the transmission hang from the bell housing because you're going to be putting tension down on the clutch disc from that shaft. You could knock it out of alignment, you could break it. It's just not something you want to do. So when you do install the transmission, just make sure either you have a partner here to help you bolt the transmission to the bell housing, or you're ready with all your hardware so you're not struggling with that too much. Now the next thing we need to do here is we need to measure. We're going to be measuring off of our pressure plate fingers here to the end of our bell housing. So I need to go ahead and get the bell housing reinstalled, and it needs to be torqued down to spec back on the block. It should be the last time we have to remove the bell housing for now. Once we have that reinstalled, I'll take you guys through the actual measurements. So we're at the back of the bell housing here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my dial indicator here and I'm going to run this down so that the tip of this dial indicator is touching on the highest point of these clutch fingers down here, of the pressure plate fingers down here. So we're going to find the highest point there, and we're going to measure off of those fingers. I'm going to use a straight edge and the bottom of my caliper here. We're just going to run that caliper flat across my straight edge into the highest point on the clutch finger here. So I'm going to take a couple measurements. First one is measuring out at 4.916 inches. We're going to do this a couple times. So my highest points are running about 930. So I measured multiple different of the fingers, the pressure plate fingers in there, and I came up with an average of about 4.925 inches. So we're gonna go up to our whiteboard up here. We're gonna write that number down, 4.925 inches. So I wanna talk about our throwout bearing here first. Now, it is adjustable with this little sleeve that spins out of the back side of the bearing. This is the Tilton 6000 series bearing. This slides out. Now the one thing you want to be careful about here is you need at least 3 full threads at a minimum of this adjustment collar inside the bearing. So first things first, let's run this all the way in. Now I already know, just from messing around with this a little bit, how this is going to come out, but let's run this all the way in. Okay, so now it's flush against the backside. So I put a little bit of assembly lube on the inside of this bearing and a little bit on the input shaft of the transmission here. And there is a little rubber O-ring here that's gonna help seat this onto the shaft and kind of hold this collar in place if you need to adjust it on the fly. So without that going on dry, it's very difficult. You have a good chance of ripping this O-ring. So just know that it is lubed up. We're going to slide this on to the input shaft here. get it lined up, and slide it all the way to the back of the case. So now we're going to measure the distance from the face of this bearing to the bell housing mounting surface here. So we'll take our straight edge again. We're going to lay that across the bearing. We're going to run our dial gauge from the bell housing mounting surface to our straight edge. And this is reading now at 3.917-ish. So that's a full inch difference from what we were measuring off of the bell housing to the pressure plate fingers. This spacer comes with this kit. I'm gonna just throw this in my dial gauge here. It reads out at about 0.752. So it's reading about 0.752 inches. So knowing that we have more than an inch gap already, and this is less than an inch, rather than run that adjustment out way out where we're going to be at the end of that adjustment, we're going to throw this spacer in front of our bearing here. So we're going to slide the bearing back off, and you'll notice that there's a chamfer in this spacer that goes back towards the transmission side. So spacer slides on like that. Then our bearing goes back on. And we're going to take another measurement once we get the bearing in place. Okay, bearing slid on, that's all the way back. Now the other thing you want to watch out for, this bearing comes fully collapsed already. Some are spring loaded. This one is not, it's not the case with this one. It is already collapsed. So if you had a spring loaded bearing, you would need to be sure that that bearing was in the depressed position when you take this measurement. It's not an issue with this Tilton bearing. So now we're going to take another measurement here. So again, put our straight edge on the bearing front. And we're just going to run that down to our straight edge. Okay, this is now reading 4.665. So before we were 4.925, now we're reading 4.665. So that's still going to be larger than our 0.125 inch gap. So that means now with this spacer in here, we can adjust this bearing to close some of that gap up. So we need to remove some of the gap out of this. And what we're going to do actually is we're just going to rotate, and you can watch the end here. You can see it move out away from that spacer on that adjustment collar. So we just put 2-3 turns in it there. We're going to stop and take another measurement here. Okay, this is now 4.885. So if we come over here, we're now at 4.885. So we're at about 0.040 inches of clearance. What we're shooting for is 0.125. Really on the low end, 0.100. On the high end, 0.150. So we've gone too far here, so we're going to actually move our bearing back in towards the transmission and take another measurement. So you'll see this bearing is so loose on the adjuster that it kind of wants to fall, right? And that's going to throw our measurement off a little bit. The other thing we're looking for here is you can see, you might be asking yourself how you're going to keep this thing locked in place and keep it from spinning. So in the bag comes a stud, and this stud is going to take the place of one of these bolts here. So we'll pull one of these bolts out, put this stud in place. The collar of this bearing is going to slide over this shaft, and we slide it on, and that's what's going to keep this from rotating. Okay, so our adjustment needs to be at one of the 4 bolt positions on this transmission. I think some other transmissions have like an offset spot where you can put the stud in. This one, it looks like you actually have to replace one of the bolts. So we're going to go ahead and try and get this lined up, right? So I turn this about a half a turn back, but I'm going to try and line this up where it's close to this bolt, so that I know if I move it just, an 1/8 of a turn or so, it's not going to affect our measurement too much there. You don't want this thing rotating all the way down, taking a measurement, and then putting another half a turn to get it back into position. That's not what you're trying to avoid here. We kind of want one of these hydraulic lines to be up and one to be down. It's just going to make bleeding this system easier. So what I'm going to do, instead of stopping at just the one there, I'm going to rotate this all the way around about a half a turn. Let's see if we can make this half turn work, okay? If this half turn works, this will be perfect, because when the bearing gets established in this position, we've got one line on top, one line on bottom. We can use this as our bleeder, this is our feed line, and that's gonna help things out tremendously here once we have the transmission in place and we are ready to bleed this clutch. If we put them both on the side, not saying you won't get it bled out properly, but it'll be much more difficult. So we can be okay with going a little short of the 0.125 if it helps us orient the bearing in the proper arrangement here. All right, now that we got this rotated around to where the bearing would be oriented with the option to have one of these as a bleeder facing straight up, let's take another measurement here and see where we're at. Should be close now, should be very close. Okay, that's 4.80. Take a second measurement. 4.801. I'm going to measure from the other side here. 4.795. 4.80. All right, so we're really much closer to 4.80 now. And I know from our previous measurement that that's going to put us right on the money, like right on the money. So we're going to come over here. We were 4.800, and that puts us exactly at our target of 0.125 inches. So we are good with that number. We're dialed in. We know we need to pull this bolt out here and install our stud, pull our bearing off, slide this back into place, and that is going to do it for this side of the transmission. We'll have our air gap set appropriately for our hydraulic release bearing. We're ready now to install the transmission onto the bell housing once we get this stud in place. All right, now we should be able to take our hydraulic release bearing here, slide it back into place, and you'll see this ear here now is going to catch our stud there, slide all the way back, and now this bearing cannot rotate, okay? And I've also got my hoses oriented towards the opening in the bell housing, which is on the driver's side. So the next thing we're gonna do is start getting this aligned up onto the back of our bell housing, slide the input shaft through the clutch disc, get our input shaft, the tip of it here, into the pilot bushing, get everything kind of lined up, and get some bolts started here on the top of our case. All right, the last thing we're gonna check here is this kit comes with two different centering rings, and it's unclear if either of these are required for this transmission. So you can see here that these both slide pretty easily right into the bell housing, like so. But you got two different sizes here. Both of these obviously fit into the bell housing, but then they take up a different amount of space around the collar itself. Let's try the larger one first. Slide this on. Okay, and that's not appropriate. You can see the reducer here fits loosely, so that's not the one we want. We're gonna go with this larger size, or the smaller inner diameter one here. Slide this over. And yes, that does fit quite snug actually, but it does fit. Okay, so I think what I'm gonna do here is I'm gonna go ahead and put this in the bell housing. It's a little snug there as well, but it does fit into the bell housing, locked in like that. Check it out, guys. We got the transmission mounted to the bell housing, mounted to the block. Not gonna lie, this is wicked cool. I'm so excited about this. It just, my excitement level grows every single night I'm out here in the shop. It just, this like this idea, this old school meets new school, just everything on this truck, right? Old school body, all beat to crap, all new suspension, all new tech underneath the truck, dual adjustable coilovers, old school block, just behind it, brand new 5-speed Tremec transmission. Just this blending of old and new and crappy and greasy and grimy and shiny. I love it. I love it. I love it. It's gonna be so darn cool. All right, guys, we're back out in the shop. It's the third day working on the transmission install here. So the other night I was able to get the transmission all mounted up to the block, everything ready to go there. This morning, I spent some time, Jeff and his brother actually already helped me pull the cab and the doghouse off of this thing. We got the engine mounts from QA1 bolted up into the chassis here. So I'm thinking this should go fairly smoothly today. I've got the rubber motor mounts down there for our engine block and transmission here. We're gonna pick this up and drop it down in the chassis and see what we need to do with the transmission cross member and everything else. So I'm gonna go ahead, get this chained up on the cherry picker, and we're gonna get it dropped into the chassis right now. This thing's heavy. Ford did not spare on the iron. Okay. Can get her come back just a hair more, I think. It's gonna come back a little bit as I drop it. So the first thing is really just getting the engine. If we need to move that rear cross member, it looks like we're going to. You can just slide that cross member back out of the way for now and let the transmission fall beyond the cross member to get the bolts lined up here.
I'm not sure what you're saying.
Just keep moving that pin. Yeah, just slide it all the way back out of the way for now. So, you guiding that side? Oh, huh. Do I have these upside down? I went by the way of the... Let me get this side set in and see if that side comes down and meets it. It might.
I'm online, but
yeah, and I think...
There we go.
Oops, should have left that in there. Oh, you're in. Okay, good.
Are you in?
Yeah, I'm in. So now it's just a matter of jacking the transmission up. Keep coming. Spare more. Okay. Come on down. It might go. It's gonna go. Yep. So there you have it, guys. We got the driveline dropped into the chassis. I'm super thrilled with how this turned out now. There were a few minor issues that we ran into here, and we're not going to address them today. My goal for today was just to get the engine and the transmission dropped into the chassis so we could start assessing some of the next steps here. Being able to see this truck sit here with an engine, a transmission in it, on its own wheels and suspension, like this has been a long time coming, and I couldn't be more thrilled about it. I couldn't be more thrilled about all the support that you guys give me. All that said, guys, if you're not subscribed to the channel, you're enjoying these videos, please consider subscribing. giving the video a thumbs up, dropping a comment down below. I interact with most of the comments. I'll be honest, if you're gonna be negative or stuff in the comments, I'm probably just gonna ignore them. I don't really have time for the negative energy stuff, but thankfully most of you guys are super supportive and I am very appreciative of that. Man, we hit 8,000 subscribers this last week. I know I talked about that in a couple videos, and growth has slowed down a little bit on the channel here lately, but that's okay because a lot of you guys are returning every week. And that means that you're enjoying the videos that I'm putting out there. And I understand that a lot of what we're doing is very specific to Ford trucks and this truck right now. And eventually over time, we'll do more broad-based content that'll attract more people. That's not what I'm concerned about right now. What I'm really focused on is this project and putting out the best videos that I can put out for you guys. So all that said, guys, you know the deal. If you don't work on your projects, they will not work on themselves. Get out in the garage, get building, and I'll see you on the next episode of Cody Builds.